I'm going to make a plug. This Saturday, we host the diocese and the bishop for the annual celebration mass of Absalom Jones. We will have numerous guests, a guest homilist. We will all be there, and we invite all of you to come and attend. It will be a very joyous celebration. If you've never seen a liturgical dancer, we even have some liturgical dancing happening. So it will be really nice. So I do encourage you, 2 o'clock next Saturday, right here. So, are we on the first slide?
Just watching you.
Oh, we're just watching me. That's a scary thought.
You want the handouts?
Oh, they can go out now, but we're going to do some handouts, but you don't need to look at them right away. There'll be a point where I'll say you can look at them. Don't distract yourself. So, can we get to the next slide? And then, okay, so we're talking music and contemplative practice. Next slide. And I'm going to start with a couple definitions, and these are my definitions. They're not the world's definitions, but this is where I'm coming from in this presentation. And that is basically spirituality and mysticism. And I'm defining spirituality as a recognition of a feeling or sense or belief that there's something greater than myself, something more than, more to being human than sensory experience, and a greater whole of which we are part of, cosmic or divine. And then mysticism is a religious belief based on a union or communion with a deity, a divine being. Mysticism is what lets you transcend the physical to the spiritual. Today, next slide. Today we're going to talk about two contemplatives. I say they're contemporary, although Howard Thurman did die in 1980. Dr. Barbara Holmes is still very much with us. And I'm going to start with Howard Thurman. Many of you may have a brief knowledge of him, may have read one of his books. The Disinherited Jesus is probably one of his most popular books. But I'm going to give you a little brief on his history. And I'm only pulling a couple things out because I could be here all day. Howard Thurman was born in 1899. His mother, his maternal grandmother, who was a former slave, raised him. His father, when he was 7, died of pneumonia. He had worked for the railroads, came home, was sick, and spent the next 4 days dying. Howard was there at that death. Now, Mom and Grandma were fine church-going ladies and took the kids, brother and sister, to the church. Dad was a learned man, but did not go to church, did not really believe in organized religion. So when he died, Mom went to her Baptist church and said, I need to bury my husband. Pastor said, no, he's not a church-going man. And that happened at several churches. And finally, a visiting preacher said, I'll hold the service. I will do it. So he did it. And then spent the entire service holding Howard's dad up as a person going to hell because he was not a church-going man. The 7-year-old boy whose beloved father, who was a good man, was going to hell. And it sat with him, and it was very much a part of him that this organized religion did this. At the same time, they lived in Daytona, and there's all this, swamp, forest land, all this land, and he'd go out into nature. And he would have these moments in nature where he would really feel he was one with nature and one with God. He was having, at age 7, mystical experiences that his slave grandma encouraged and had him talk about. She didn't poo-poo him. She didn't say, oh no, you're not doing it. She believed in these moments. And so this was Howard's initial grounding with religion. In those times, when he graduated basically 7th, 8th grade, that was the end of all school for blacks, unless you went to one of 3 high schools in Florida. And the nearest one was 100 miles away in Jacksonville. And his family was poor. The community raised up funds and sent him. He graduated valedictorian with a full ride scholarship to Morehouse College. Graduated Morehouse College valedictorian, was one of 2 black taken to this Rochester Theological Seminary. Every year they would take 2 because they did have to have black preachers for the black congregations. So they would take 2 black, and those were the only, going through. So he had his experience there. He actually had some really good inclusive experiences there. Then when he graduated, he married Kate Kelly. They were in Ohio. He had his first church. About 1929, he left the church he was working and moved to Haverford College because he had met Rufus Jones. Rufus Jones was a Quaker philosopher, mystic, and pacifist. And this resonated with Howard. He loved the message. He loved the whole combination of this. So he went there to study under Rufus Jones. In 1930, Kate died of tuberculosis because she worked in the tuberculosis wards. And then in 1932, he marries Mary Sue Bailey, also an activist and educator. Another important part of Howard's early life is a pilgrimage that he led, pilgrimage of friendship. He led about 10, 12 people, and they visited Burma, Ceylon, and India. And that's where he met Gandhi. And Gandhi wanted to meet him and his group because he was trying to understand the black experience here in the U.S., and they wanted to meet Gandhi because of his experience with nonviolence and belief in change through nonviolence. And this was really where Howard Thurman solidified his belief. He came back, and he was at Howard University, but then met another gentleman, Alfred Fisk, a white minister, and in San Francisco, they opened up the Fellowship Church in San Francisco. And we might have to be, no, we're good. This was the nation's first interracial, interfaith congregation. And at one point, it had over 1,500 people. It was an offering of a new community in San Francisco. You had a lot of blacks coming in for the defense. Remember, this is 1944, so we're in a war. And Asian and white. And it was really a whole new thing. And this church, because he did not believe in organized religion, this was the fallout for him. This was a non-organized church of faith. And he was there through 53, and then he went back to Boston. And in Boston, he was invited to be the dean of the Marsh Chapel. This was a huge, huge thing. First black man to be a dean at a white, or primarily white university, and then to be the dean of the Marsh Chapel. He spent a lot of time there. In about 1960-something, he went back to San Francisco to pretty much hold his foundation, the Howard Thurman Educational Trust. That was 1965, and run that. He's also honorary canon of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. There's our little Episcopal connection. Next slide. So Howard Thurman was not an activist, so to speak, frontline activist. What he was the spiritual leader for the activists. He was a good friend with Martin Luther King and others. He was considered what is called a social mystic. And that was a definition of an activist form of mysticism compelled by the dictates of spiritual experience that defies social conventions and engenders social change. Many of the activists at the time, Martin Luther King included, the Disinherited Jesus had been written. They would carry that book in their pocket on their marches. Howard Thurman would be part of those marches, but he was never on the stage. He was always in the crowd. He didn't consider himself the leader of the movement. He considered himself the member of the movement. And he was the one who helped with the the nonviolence, the pacifism. A lot of people do not know, but the black community spent, and people who came in with this movement, spent years practicing nonviolent techniques so that in their marches and in their places where there might be confrontation, they had the skill set not to react, but to remain nonviolent. And a lot of that came from Howard Thurman, from his pacifism with the Quakers, Gandhi, to today. So it was really kind of cool. Howard Thurman was a preacher, a lecturer for the colleges, and did a lot of speaking engagements. And in all of those, he would always have or start with a meditation. So we're talking back. He's doing meditations in a church service. Pretty, forward thinking, right? And he has a book called Inward Journey, and he also has another book, Meditations from the Heart. And in his foreword for Inward Journey, which is up there are not many windows into these meditations. They are, as the title indicates, an inward journey. It may be that if there were more illustrations, the meaning could be more quickly grasped. The choice here is deliberate. It is my hope that they will make reading and rereading, or hearing and rehearing, rewarding and sustaining. The purpose remains ever the same: to focus the mind and the heart upon God as the eternal source and goal of life. To find him as a companion and presence. And then this is kind of where some of the social activism comes in. To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And who do we know that did that? Jesus. With him. So, I want you all to sit still. If you can, close your eyes, do that. If you're uncomfortable doing that, just put your eyes down. So this is Howard Thurman. Now, he has a very unique delivery. So you might find it a little different, a little off-putting, but settle in, listen to the words, and then we're going to do a little exercise after that. So you are on the next slide.
How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting love. With full intensity, we seek ere the quiet passes a fresh sense of order in our living. what end do we make sacrifices? Where is my treasure? And what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life? And to what am I true in life? Over and over the questions beat in upon us. As we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. And then it seems sometimes that our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our steps. And then we know how good it is to center down.
Howard loved silence. He was not afraid of it. He embraced it. And he invited everybody who came into his world to also be in that silence, because that is where he was in the forest with nature, and God was in that silence, and that's where he met God. And so he wanted that to be for everybody. So on your handout is the reflection, but also our 3 questions. What am I doing with my life? Where is my treasure? And what am I true in life? So I invite you at your tables to have a little conversation right now. We'll only spend a few minutes. We have lots to do. But have a few minutes to kind of, what resonated in this for you. So take a few minutes, and we'll come right back. Do you want me to skip Barbara Holmes and then just move to yours? Thank you.
to know that they've got it.
Okay, you've got 30 seconds.
30 seconds. We'll probably just take it from one of the shots.
And you can go to the next screen. Are they back?
Oh, we're still waiting on one. We got about 5 seconds. All right, yeah, we're good.
Okay, I'm going to move us along. I hope conversation was rich. Reverend Dr. Barbara Holmes, I'm going to be really quick on this because I want us to get to Robert's part of this. She is a scholar of African American spirituality and mysticism. She currently is working for the Center of Action and Contemplation, Richard Rohr School of Wisdom. She is President Emeritus of the United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities. She basically has a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, minor in Theater Arts, Master of Science in Education, Master of Divinity, a doctorate in Religion and Ethics from Vanderbilt, and she has a law degree. So the woman is pretty unaccomplished. What can I say? One of her books, Joy Unspeakable, so we can go to the next one, she presents a number of meditations and reflections. And in Joy Unspeakable, one of them is the Contemplative Jesus, the Gethsemane prayers. And what she talks about here is that Jesus is praying a lament when he's in Gethsemane. And a lament is a prayer expressing sorrow, pain, confusion. It's a chief way for many Christians to process grief in God's presence. And because many Christians have grown up in churches which always look on the bright side, lament can be jarring. And for believers whose lives are relatively free from tragedy, lament may seem unnecessary. It can sound like a big downer. So from Holmes' book, she points out that in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Jewish lament becomes a discourse of inquiry and obedience. And as Walter Brueggemann noted, a lament is the language of prayer in the mouths of people who believe that God will answer, hear, and respond. They are real prayers prayed in real hope to a real God to make real answers. Jesus asks for the cup to be removed. And when the answer does not come, Jesus responds to the silence out of the depth of his divinity and of the confusion of his humanity. Your will be done. Barbara Holmes reminds us that contemplation and prayer are attitudes of watchfulness. We are most alert when we are in a prayerful place. Remember, Jesus is in the garden with his disciples, asking them to stay and pray with him. They fall asleep, but he still continues to pray. So we don't have time because I'm going to give you more than 20 minutes because I love what you've got. But on your sheet are another series of questions. When have you been in a Garden of Gethsemane, asking God for something? When have you left decision-making based on thought and reason, and instead, like Jesus, turned inward for the answers? And when have you offered a prayer expressing sorrow, pain, or confusion? So that's your homework assignment today, okay? You're going to take those home with you and contemplate. Yes, Sally? Oh, you don't have those on the sheet? All right, write them down. There they are. We'll give you 2 minutes to write them down. I'm sorry. When have you been in a Garden of Gethsemane asking God for something? When have you left decision-making process based on thought and reason and instead, like Jesus, turned inward for your answers? When have you lifted it up to God, lifted it up to Jesus, and prayed about something? And when have you offered a prayer expressing sorrow, pain, or confusion? Everybody have enough time? Still writing, still writing.
Can I trade mics with you?
Yes. No, we're now moving into.
So friends, other good news is that this presentation is going to be posted either tomorrow or Tuesday on our website, so you'll be able to see all of this there as well. But I see folks taking photos of the screen, so good on you. All right. Debbie started it. See, could I get the next slide, please? Thank you. I want to talk about the spirituals. The spirituals are songs that were created in the midst of slavery. They're one of the earliest forms of American folk music, one of the most noteworthy forms. And the genre came about in the practice of various gatherings of slaves that were either called praise houses or outside meetings called bush meetings or camp meetings. And one reason I want to talk about the spirituals is because the gospel itself, the gospel of Jesus, and music have both a universal expression and very particular expressions. You can go to the Bible and read the gospel, and then it comes to life in your own experience, in your own soul. God's salvation has a universal tinge to it. It means the same thing for everyone, and we experience it differently. And we share those experiences. Music is the same way. You listen to music, you're not quite sure what you're listening to. For someone else, it's transcendent, right? And then you share that song with someone and you're watching their face. You're like, I don't think you feel the same thing I do in this. So that particularity helps the gospel and songs come to life, and it speaks to the soul of the people who hear it and who write it. Calling these spirituals come from this reading from Ephesians 5. Be filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all the things unto God the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now that phrase, speaking to yourselves, that translation's not quite right. It's actually speaking to each other. Speaking to each other. Paul, when he wrote this letter, was writing in a context in which it was a Christian minority. The wider culture around the Christians did not support the Christian way of life, and so speaking to each other was the way in which they told themselves their story. They affirmed their life. They affirmed their faith and their reality. So in slavery, the enslaved had white ministers teaching them that they were at their proper station in life, their proper lower station, while the enslavers are naturally superior. But for the ministers among the slaves and the slaves themselves, they had the audacity to believe the promises of God and of the American Revolution, that all were created equal and God was no respecter of persons, as Peter puts it in the book of Acts. So in their own religious meetings, licit and illicit, allowed and unallowed, you could get an enslaver to give you a bottle of whiskey, but if they found you learning how to read from the Bible, that's when the bats came out. in these songs, these slaves were speaking to themselves. And people heard it differently. They mean different things. Then comes emancipation, the end of the Civil War. The spiritual tradition becomes more deeply known among people in the United States. And in the 50 years and 60 years after emancipation, the tradition begins to get exploited and commercialized. Next slide, please. Thank you. Psalm 137, 1 through 4. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps, for there our captors asked of us songs. And our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? This psalm comes after the Babylonian captivity. It is a lament. It is one of the most piercing psalms in all the book of Psalms. It does not end with joy. It ends with happy are those who take your babies' heads and dashes them against the rock. It is a song born of a trauma response. And that is sung because they experienced it. They saw the Babylonians do that to them. What does it mean when those songs are co-opted by the dominant culture? What does it mean when your tormentor asks for mirth and then uses those songs to either make fun of those who sung them originally or trivialize those who sing them? Next slide, please. An example of this came up in Morehouse College. Morehouse College is a historically black university in Atlanta. And in 1923, a group of the General Education Board came to Morehouse College. Now, the way this went is that you're never quite sure how your funding was going to go for your black college in Atlanta, right? So they do the best they can to make a good impression, and that involves them coming to chapel, they're distinguished guests, and then they can bring the student body to its feet with a rousing spiritual. So they go into the chapel this day in 1923 at this visit. And the way it works is you have the person who strikes up the band. The first person sings the first line, and then the entire chapel lifts up and sings together. So this is what happens. They get up, they say the first line, and then nothing. Silence. So they do it again. Nothing. So the dean of the school calls the entire student body to an assembly that night, reads them the riot act, to which they reply, "We refuse to sing our songs to delight and amuse white people. The songs are ours, and they're part of the source of our own inspiration, transmitted to us by our forefathers." And this was a sign of a challenged relationship between the next generation and the next generation removed from slavery, who could, in turns, either feel embarrassed by the tradition of the songs because of how they were being used, or think the songs too simplistic to really speak to the complexity of the Christian faith. This happened during Howard Thurman's senior year at Morehouse. And it set the stage for his own reflection on the meaning of the spirituals. And he wrote about this all throughout the rest of his life, and it was collected in a book in the 1960s. I want to listen to one of the spirituals and see what we can discern from it. It's going to be on your next page. It's called, depending on who you're talking to and who recorded it, It's either called I Got Shoes or Heaven, Heaven. This is a version that was recorded in 1939 by the same company, the record company, who told Bob Dylan he needs to quit singing the Christian songs because he'll never make any money doing that. I don't think we have time to get into a breakout, but on the sheet with the lyrics for this, I have a couple of questions that I'd like for you to consider. And we'll have an opportunity to share. Are there parts of the song that inspire you or challenge you? Are there phrases that resonate with you? And what's the mood of the song? What's the mood of it? Let's take a few moments and then I'll bring us back to share. We'll take another minute or so. All right, friends. Let's treat the first two questions fairly similarly. So, are there parts of the song that either inspire you or challenge you, or there are phrases that resonate with you? Those can be the same thing, or they may be different. We have a couple of roving mics around, so if you'd like to share, I invite you to. All right. We have one here and then one over here.
Okay, I was just thinking when I read this that, as a kid, for every camp I ever went to, we sang this on the school bus.
Huh.
But, but now looking at the refrain, I think, I can hear kind of a subtle laugh at, not just at the people that someone knew that maybe was talking about having too much, but the whole dominant culture. It's like Yeah, let me make a little bit of fun of people here.
Yeah.
They may be talking about heaven,
Hmm.
but that's it.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm
Say your name, please.
Tish.
Thank you.
I'm moved by the use of shoes because I see shoes as the action of the heart and the soul, and maybe soul comes from shoes, and maybe it's what we do and not what we think.
Hmm.
Maybe the suffering is a choice of the mind, and the heart and the soul is the package that we're able to do what our nature is, which is love. And the nature of God and man is love.
Thank you. We have time for one more if anyone else wants to. Barbara? Or, I'm sorry, Margaret.
Close to Barbara, it's okay.
Yeah.
I guess I was thinking, sorry, Margaret, from a trauma perspective, or from the time where if you're being oppressed, and religion has been used to oppress, in terms of, well, it's okay, this is your lot here, but you'll have your reward in heaven, so just endure this suffering and stay in your place. And then it really is to keep people in line. And to me, this is like a song about awareness. I got a robe, you got a robe, we all got a robe. And when I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my robe. But in the refrain, it's clear, ain't flying there to heaven. I'm going to shout all over God's heaven, almost like it's a kind of discrete confrontation about we know where heaven is. It's not there, it's here, and we all get to be a part of heaven. I don't know, that's what it's kind of saying to me.
Thank you.
Joanne had something to say.
Joanne? Yeah.
What I felt was that this message expressed a yearning for a place where the basic comforts of life are available freely and equally to everyone. And it also felt like a salvation song about a life free from enslavement and hardship. So it was, to me, a very uplifting song. There was an inner strength in the enslaved population that bubbled up regardless of their situation. So that's what kept people together, I think.
Thank you, Joanne. There are two lines that stand out to me. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to walk all over God's heaven. And everybody talking about heaven ain't flying there. I'm going to talk about those two in particular. So I'm going to walk all over God's heaven. I'd like us to take a little bit of time to grasp a fuller meaning of that line, a fuller meaning of that line. And I'm going to show some historical images that can be troubling. Okay? Next slide. This slave is Wallace. This picture is from the Library of Congress. What he's wearing is a slave collar. If you had been proven to perhaps spend a little bit of time off the plantation more than you should have, you might find yourself wearing one of these. They're designed this particular way so that if you find yourself running through bush, you get caught on it. Can we go back one slide? This is from my hometown. It is a slave pass. In order for a slave to travel freely from a plantation into town, you needed one of these. Now, part of that, for the owner's benefit, was to be able to make sure that your slave didn't get caught up in a patrol. It's kind of like a dog at a pound. You put a tag on him, right? So slaves did not have freedom of movement at all. And so this was essentially saying that the mayor of Mobile gives permission for this slave to visit a house on Monroe and gives the date for it. And this is the context of if you misuse one of these passes, you might end up with one of the collars. Can you go back to that? Thank you. By the way, on his head is branded the initials of his owner. Next slide, please.
Could I just say something though about that guy?
Oh. Hold on a second, Sally.
I don't know if I'm seeing what I want to see in his picture, but he looks like he has a lot of dignity.
Yeah,
There he is, like
yeah,
finger up to you, bud.
yeah. That is even more visible in another picture of him, in a profile that also exists of him. Next slide, please. It's hard to see. It's going to be hard to see this here, but we can put the PowerPoint up. This is a painting from 1820. The woman here is wearing one of those collars. So this was common enough that in New Orleans, in the city, you would see this walking down the street. Next slide, please. This is another example of one of them with bells on that make it easy also to be able to track if someone runs. Next one, please. This one's more graphic. This is once the transatlantic slave trade ended, you had to make your own slaves. And so you would let them out as livestock. Billingsworth and let horses, mules, and dark Negro slaves. So you'd let them out, but they kept this on so that their ownership was clear. I'm not doing this to be gratuitous, at least I don't think so. Hear the promise of that song again. I'm going to walk all over God's heaven. And what their overseer hears, and what their enslaver hears in that statement could be, they just want to be lazy. They don't hear a desire to be free. And think about the promise of that statement in a world in which you do not have control over your own body, your reproductive options. All right. Next slide, please. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. That refrain. Howard Thurman talks about the refrain this way. As a slave listened to their preachers, both white and black, they heard the scriptures. They heard about the promise of heaven. Naturally, the enslaver thought himself fitting in that category, but so did the slave. He too knew he was going to heaven. Now maybe that slave thought, well, there must be two heavens. But no, there's only one God, and God cannot be divided like that. I have it. I'm having my hell now. I'll have my heaven later. My enslaver is having his heaven now. When he dies, he shall have his hell. The next day, the slave is chopping cotton and sings to his mate, I got shoes, you got shoes. All God's children got shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes and we're going to walk all over God's heaven. Then looks over to the big house. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. Now, Thurman does not necessarily endorse this interpretation, but I think he's dead on accurate to the mood of it. And there's echoes here of the story in Luke of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man and Lazarus. If you'll remember that story, the rich man is dressed sumptuously, and Lazarus, as a poor man, languishes at his gate. And when they get to heaven, the rich man finds himself in hell. Lazarus is brought up to be with Abraham. A spiritual committed to writing and thought to have originated in Virginia goes, "Rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham." Spirituals were not only songs expressing the truths of the faith, but songs of coded protest. At a time in which slaves could not be insubordinate, these songs expressed their longing to be free. And the slaves saw themselves in the stories of liberation in the Bible. And as they sang about those who had been liberated before, the songs carried their own hopes of freedom, be it otherworldly, be it the promise of heaven, or the hope of freedom in this life. The spirituals are extreme examples of what happens when theology meets oppression, and how that is lived in the life of faith. And they carry lament, and they give voice to sadness, but they also encode hope and resistance and the promise of a God who hears, who cares, who loves, who saves, and who liberates. Be filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Give thanks always unto all things, unto God the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Next week, we will be celebrating the ordination of Absalom Jones. That'll be Saturday at 2 p.m. Please join us. And next Sunday at 9, we'll have some time to reflect on the journey of the last couple of weeks that we have spent leading up to that service. Thank you.